Layla Jenkins walked into Westbrook Academy with a backpack that had been stitched up twice and shoes that still held the dust of two previous owners. Her uniform was clean but not new, slightly off in shade from the others, having been bought secondhand from a local donation bin. The girls at the gates barely glanced at her before giggling, their ponytails swishing in unison like a chorus line in designer shoes. Layla had never seen a school like this before. The glass foyer sparkled. The reception desk looked more like a hotel counter, and the students moved like they were born into the space, their bodies relaxed in wealth and expectation. Layla was not relaxed. She walked with shoulders slightly hunched, her backpack too heavy with books she did not yet need, and eyes that tried not to linger on the trophies, the paintings, the golden lettering above the auditorium that said, "Leaders are made here." In her first class, she sat down at the edge of the row, avoiding eye contact. When the teacher called out her name, a boy in the second row let out a soft snort. Later, he would walk by her in the hallway and whisper, "Scholarship trash." She had not known how fast kids could judge, how quickly they could measure the worth of someone based on laces, labels, or last names. She had not known that even the lunchroom could be divided. There were the girls who brought sushi rolls and almond milk, and then there was Layla with her peanut butter sandwich and apple slices wrapped in reused foil. Her mother had prepared them with care, adding a small note that said, "You can do anything." Layla never read those notes at school. She knew someone would spot them and twist them into something ugly. Within days, her locker had been tampered with. Someone had switched her textbooks with blank journals. Another day, a sticky note had been pressed onto her locker door that said, "Made in training." Layla removed it without a sound and pressed her forehead to the cold metal for one quiet second before carrying on. She never cried at school. At night sometimes, but not during the day. She refused to give them the satisfaction. By the end of her second week, she had already been labeled. She was the ghost girl, the poor girl, the girl who did not belong. In art class, she drew beautiful sketches of places she had never visited. Her teacher once paused and said, "This is excellent work, Layla." And a girl named Brielle whispered loudly, "Pity she cannot afford an art studio." Laughter followed. Always laughter. That bitter little echo that crawls under your skin and reminds you that you are alone. It was the third Friday of the semester when the school announced its annual Legacy and Leadership Luncheon. Flyers were handed out in every homeroom. The event was mandatory. Students were required to bring a parent or guardian. The goal, the principal explained, was to encourage students to understand the legacy of excellence they were a part of and the leaders they came from. Layla stared at the flyer for a long time. She had never met her father. Her mother rarely spoke of him except to say, "He is not here, but you are, and that is enough." Layla knew she could ask her mother to come, but the idea of watching her stand next to men in tailored suits and women in pearl necklaces made her stomach twist. Her mother worked nights at the hospital and barely had enough time to sleep, so Layla made up her mind. She would show up alone. The day of the luncheon arrived like a thunderstorm. The school was decorated in banners of blue and gold. A red carpet was laid out along the walkway. A tent was raised over the lawn with white linens and name cards on every table. The air smelled of catered salmon and sparkling cider. Layla wore the same dress she had worn to a cousin's wedding 2 years ago. It was navy, plain, a little tight at the shoulders now, but clean. She arrived early and stood near the back of the crowd, trying to remain unnoticed. As families filed in, she heard introductions. "This is my father, chief of surgery. This is my mother, founder of Everly Cosmetics. This is my dad, chairman of the Caldwell Group." Bryce Caldwell, that same boy who had mocked her during homeroom, strutted in wearing a suit too expensive for his age. He caught Layla's eye and smirked. "Where is your +1?" he asked. "Could not afford the ticket?" The girls beside him laughed. Layla said nothing. Instead, she adjusted the silver pin her mother had clipped to her dress, her only accessory, and turned her head away. But at exactly 1 minute past noon, something shifted in the air. A car pulled up to the valet lane. Not just any car, a long black vehicle with custom wheels and a flag on the front that looked unfamiliar. The driver stepped out wearing a dark suit and opened the rear door. A man stepped out slowly. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a charcoal gray suit with polished shoes and an expression that made people move. Teachers stood up, parents turned. Even the principal walked briskly from the far end of the tent to greet him. And then the unimaginable happened. The man walked toward Layla, placed a hand on her shoulder, and said, "Ready?" She nodded, and together they entered the crowd. The silence was immediate and absolute. Bryce Caldwell's mouth hung open. Brielle dropped her fork, and one by one, people began to realize they had made a very big mistake. The man standing beside Layla was not just any guest. His face, now visible under the filtered sunlight, looked vaguely familiar to several of the adults present. Whispers began almost instantly, soft and confused at first, then slowly turning into murmurs of recognition. One of the teachers narrowed her eyes. "Is that—" "No, it cannot be." Another whispered, "I have seen him before. On the news, maybe?" Bryce Caldwell leaned in closer, squinting. His smirk had vanished. The man gave no speeches. He asked for no special attention. He simply guided Layla to her seat at the center table, which had been left empty. Without any effort, he became the most important person in the room. Heads turned as he pulled out her chair with quiet care, as though this simple act held more power than the gold-plated name cards around them. A staff member appeared beside the principal, whispering in his ear. The principal's face drained of color. His smile twitched uncomfortably before he cleared his throat and addressed the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "we are honored to have a very distinguished guest among us today." More whispers. Layla looked straight ahead, her hands folded on her lap. She did not fidget. She did not shrink. She waited. "Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Elijah Malik," the principal continued. "A global humanitarian, strategist, and decorated military officer whose leadership has reshaped multiple international aid efforts across 3 continents. Gasps spread like wildfire across the tent. Elijah Malik, a man whose name had appeared in diplomatic articles, whose speeches had aired on public broadcast stations, whose policies had been adopted by world leaders. He was a legend in quiet rooms, a man who had declined interviews, declined honors, declined fame, but not fatherhood. He reached for Layla's hand and gave it a soft squeeze, and in that moment, the girl who had been mocked, cornered, and silenced became untouchable. The girls who had snickered in the halls now looked down at their plates. The boys who had mimicked her clothes now adjusted their own collars, unsure what to do with their hands. And Bryce Caldwell, who had once offered her spare change through a limousine window, now stared with a frozen expression that held something Layla had never seen on his face before: fear. The rest of the luncheon passed in a daze for most, but for Layla, every moment moved in crisp clarity. She watched as teachers who had once ignored her in hallways now hovered near her table. She noticed how parents who had never met her mother suddenly wanted to know everything about her father. Elijah spoke only when spoken to. He was polite, quiet, not boastful, but his silence spoke louder than any monologue. He was a man who had seen war and famine, had stood beside kings and in refugee tents, and somehow found his way to this private school luncheon like he belonged nowhere and everywhere all at once. When asked how long he would be staying, he simply said, "I go where I am needed, but I am always present when it matters most." At one point, Brielle's mother walked over and complimented Layla's dress. Layla thanked her without emotion. She did not need their admiration. She had never asked for it. After the event, when the tables were being cleared and the students were told to return to class, Elijah walked Layla to the hallway. Other students passed her with careful glances now. None of them spoke. Bryce pretended to check his phone as he brushed past. He did not look up. Elijah leaned close to Layla and said softly, "They will say they were only joking, that they never meant harm." She nodded. "I know." And he said something she would remember for the rest of her life. Sometimes power is not about raising your voice. Sometimes it is about who stands with you when the silence falls. As he turned to leave, she felt something loosen in her chest, a knot that had been there for weeks, slowly untying. That afternoon in history class, Layla raised her hand. It was the first time she had volunteered to speak. The teacher, still stunned from the luncheon, nodded. She stood and gave her answer clearly, confidently. No one interrupted. After class, a girl who had once scoffed at her shoes whispered, "You did really well." Layla only nodded. She did not smile. She did not forget. But she did begin to breathe easier. At home that night, her mother asked gently how the luncheon went. Layla looked up from her bowl of soup and said, "I think they see me now." Her mother smiled. "Good." Now show them who you are. From that day on, things shifted, slowly, subtly. The teasing stopped. The looks changed. Students began to speak to her, not at her. Teachers called on her more. Some of it was performative, of course. Westbrook Academy cared deeply about appearances, but some of it was real. Daniel, a quiet boy from her biology class, offered to be her lab partner. A week later, he would sit with her at lunch. A month later, she would start a tutoring group for students struggling in mathematics. And when asked why she was doing it, she would simply reply, because nobody should feel small in a place meant to make them grow. As weeks passed, Layla's presence at Westbrook Academy was no longer treated as an anomaly. It became a quiet fact, a reality the school had no choice but to acknowledge. The more students spoke to her, the more they realized that the jokes had never been funny. She was smart, sharply observant, thoughtful in a way that made her stand out in group discussions. She never tried to prove herself, and yet, by simply showing up, by refusing to shrink, she had already done just that. Her math scores were now posted on the class board with consistent top marks. Her literature essays were read aloud for style and clarity. One teacher even pulled her aside and said, "You have a mind that does not chase trends. Hold on to that." But even as admiration grew, Layla noticed something else: the strange behavior of those who had once humiliated her. Bryce Caldwell started acting unusually polite, holding doors open and offering awkward nods in passing. He never apologized, not directly. Instead, he tried to erase the past by pretending it had never happened. Brielle began copying Layla's notes during class. She would hand her worksheets to Layla with a soft compliment. "I love how neat your handwriting is," but the warmth was brittle, like glass that would crack with one honest word. Layla never fed into it. She kept her boundaries firm. She knew the difference between respect and regret. One morning, a guidance counselor invited Layla into her office and asked if she would consider running for student council the following year. The counselor smiled and said, "You have leadership qualities. I see the way others follow your lead. It is quiet, but it is strong." Layla thanked her and said she would think about it. That evening at home, she mentioned it to her mother. Her mother stopped mid-stir at the stove and said, "Well, it is about time the school recognized what I already knew." Then she added, "Did your father ever tell you about the time he organized a youth council in South Sudan during a drought?" Layla shook her head. No, he did not. Her mother chuckled. He would never bring it up. But that is where he got the idea for community-led water stations. He said he got it from watching you build a lemonade stand when you were 5 and convince half the block to join. Layla smiled, her eyes softening. She had always wondered what her father saw in her. Now she knew. The school year marched forward, and the seasons began to change. Layla started wearing her hair in a simple braid tied with a ribbon her aunt had given her. She no longer looked like a ghost drifting through hallways. She walked like she belonged, not because someone said she could, but because she had chosen to. Her lunchbox, though still the same scratched one, now held small extras that her mother had added with pride. One day it was a folded napkin with a pressed flower, another day a tiny slice of leftover pie, and sometimes a folded piece of paper with a quote. One read, "You are not here to be accepted. You are here to awaken." When Layla read that one, she kept it in her pencil case. There were still moments when old habits crept in, a raised eyebrow from a parent, a joke passed between students when they thought she was not listening. But those moments no longer cut the same way. They glanced off her like dull arrows, unable to pierce. She had learned something most students had not yet realized, that real power does not come from lineage or money or matching uniforms. It comes from knowing who you are when nobody claps. The final month of the school year brought the return of the annual Spring Expo, where students were invited to showcase projects in science, arts, and community service. Layla submitted an interactive display on resource equity, including case studies on water access, public education, and nutrition programs. Her presentation included charts, photographs, and even a video segment narrated in her own voice. It was bold, it was compassionate, and it was impossible to ignore. During the event, a cluster of parents stood in front of her booth asking thoughtful questions. Layla answered each with clarity, her voice calm and unwavering. A man in a suit with a name badge that read, Regional Director for Youth Initiatives nodded after hearing her presentation and said, "Would you ever consider speaking at a youth conference? We need more voices like yours." She thanked him and said she would love to. Afterward, as students packed up their tables and rolled up their posters, Bryce approached. He stood there for a moment, shuffling awkwardly, and then said, "Hey, your project was amazing." Layla looked at him, expression unreadable. "Thank you," she said simply. Bryce hesitated, then added, "I was not very nice to you earlier this year. I guess I did not know who you were." Layla's eyes narrowed slightly. "That is the problem," she said. "You had to know who my father was before you treated me like a person." He looked down, ashamed. "I know. I am sorry." She nodded once. Apology accepted, but not forgotten. She turned and walked away. Behind her, Bryce remained standing there, understanding that those 6 words would echo in his mind for a long time. By the time final exams approached, Layla had become something of a quiet anchor in her grade. Not the most popular, not the most praised, but the one who remained steady while others wavered. A girl from another homeroom had started sitting beside her during assemblies. A boy from science club had asked her for help preparing for a quiz. Even the faculty had noticed. The history teacher had recently nominated her for an academic enrichment program over the summer. But Layla did not care for attention. She did not crave awards or validation. Her mind was on something else. A girl she had once seen crying in the bathroom after Brielle made a cruel joke about her stutter. A boy who never spoke up in debate class, even though Layla had overheard him say something brilliant under his breath. She remembered what it felt like to sit alone, to be judged, to be invisible. And now that she was no longer invisible, she wanted to change what that meant for others. So she started quietly. A compliment here, a shared seat there, an invitation to join her in the library after school to study. She never made it about charity, she made it about community, and little by little it caught on. One afternoon, her English teacher asked students to write about a moment that changed them. Layla's essay was short but sharp. She wrote about a moment at a lunch table when someone called her a name and nobody stopped them. She described the silence that followed, the way it echoed louder than the insult itself. She ended with a line that made her teacher pause. "I did not need a table. I needed a voice loud enough to build my own." That essay was shared at the next faculty meeting. Her name was never mentioned aloud, but every teacher in the room knew exactly who had written it. One counselor, after reading it, wiped a tear from her cheek and said, "That is what we should be teaching. Not just algebra and grammar, but how not to be silent when silence is cruelty." As the school year came to an end, the administration announced the theme for the final assembly: legacy and character. Students were asked to nominate peers who embodied those words. Layla's name appeared again and again on the slips. When the principal stood at the podium and began the final speech, she did not expect anything. She sat quietly 3 rows back, hands in her lap. But then the principal said something that made her look up. This year, we were reminded that leadership is not always loud. It does not always come from a stage. Sometimes it walks through our halls in silence, changing hearts without asking for credit. Then he said her name. There was a pause in the room, a beat of disbelief, then soft claps, then louder ones. And when Layla rose to walk toward the front, the applause became a standing ovation, not for her father, not for her connections, but for the girl who came to school every day knowing she was judged and kept showing up anyway. She accepted the award with the same quiet composure that had come to define her. She thanked her teachers, her peers, her mother. She did not mention her father. She did not need to. He had given her his strength. But the rest, her resilience, her clarity, her voice, those were hers alone. That summer, Layla spent 3 weeks at the academic enrichment program. She made new friends. She shared ideas. She stood at a podium and gave a talk about equality in education systems that left the room in still silence. When she returned to Westbrook in the fall, she was no longer the poor girl. She was no longer the outsider. She was simply Layla, the girl who had walked through fire and emerged unburned, the girl who had been underestimated, then feared, then finally respected. During the first week of the new school year, a new student joined her homeroom, a girl with frizzy hair and scuffed shoes. She sat in the same seat Layla had sat in 1 year earlier. The other students glanced at her, then looked away. But Layla turned in her chair, smiled, and said, "You can sit with me at lunch if you want." The girl's face lit up with something that looked like hope, and just like that, the cycle broke. Because Layla had not just endured the cruelty, she had transformed it. She had taken every whisper, every slight, every insult, and used it as brick and mortar to build something no one could take away from her. Not a legacy of wealth, but a legacy of kindness. News of Layla's quiet rise at Westbrook began to spread beyond the school's pristine walls. It was not that she went around broadcasting her victories. She never did. But people notice grace under pressure. They notice when someone moves through a system not built for them and refuses to be bitter or broken. One of the senior teachers submitted her name to a national mentorship program without telling her. When she got the acceptance email, Layla blinked in surprise. It included access to Leaders in Education, a paid summer internship, and a letter of recognition from an international human rights organization. Her mother cried when she read it aloud. Her father, who had returned to fieldwork overseas, sent her a handwritten letter that simply said, "You remind me of the world I have always tried to protect." It was folded around a pressed flower. Layla kept it tucked inside the cover of her favorite novel. Meanwhile, at school, a new culture had started to form. One where other students looked to her not for gossip, but for guidance. Some students who had once ignored her now leaned in to listen. During a student town hall, Layla spoke about the need for an inclusive scholarship committee, one that did not just bring students in but supported them afterward. The room went quiet when she spoke, not out of politeness, but reverence. She had become the kind of leader who never called herself one. And the irony was not lost on anyone, that the girl who had once been told she did not belong was now the model of what belonging looked like. Even the school board began to take notice. A trustee invited her to speak at a quarterly meeting. The principal stood beside her and introduced her as one of Westbrook's brightest examples of resilience. Layla took the podium and began her speech with a line no one expected. "I was not supposed to make it here." The room froze. And then she told the truth. Not to shame, not to retaliate, but to reveal. She spoke of lockers vandalized, lunches mocked, the weight of silence. Then she described the shift, the moment her father walked through the tent that day, and how everyone's treatment changed. She said, "The point of this speech is not to tell you how hard I worked. It is to ask why I had to work twice as hard to be seen." The applause afterward was not just loud, it was sustained, long enough that Layla had to bow her head and wait before returning to her seat. That night, the board approved her scholarship committee proposal. It would be implemented the following semester. Later that year, Westbrook Academy unveiled a new initiative called Legacy Through Action, a student-led campaign to foster empathy and equity through service. Layla was named its first coordinator. The role came with meetings, speaking engagements, and responsibility. But Layla never let the title distract her. She still brought her own lunch. She still helped younger students find their way to class. She still sat beside kids who looked uncertain on their first day and said, "I know what that feels like," because she did. One afternoon, while organizing a clothing drive for students in nearby districts, she saw Bryce Caldwell across the quad. He was helping a younger student carry a box of donations. They locked eyes briefly. He gave a small nod. She returned it. No more. No less. The story between them did not need revisiting. Some stories are best left in the rear view, their lessons carried but not relived. But Layla's story was far from over. She had plans. Her mentors had connected her with youth representatives from other schools. They were forming a coalition to push for better access to academic resources in underfunded communities. Layla was one of the youngest members. That summer, she traveled with the group to 3 cities. She spoke at panels. She wrote position papers. She shook hands with leaders and policymakers. But through it all, she never forgot where she started. On her final night before returning home, she sat in a quiet hotel room and wrote a letter to the new girl she had met back at school, the one who reminded her so much of herself. She folded the letter and left it with the school counselor to be delivered on the first day of term. It read, "Dear you, do not let the stares stop you. Do not let the silence confuse you. They do not know your story yet, but they will. And one day, someone else will look at you and say, 'Because of her, I kept going.'" Layla signed it with just a single letter, L. On her flight home, she leaned her head against the window and smiled softly. She had not just endured the system, she had rewritten part of it, and there was more to come, much more. The start of Layla's next school year brought unfamiliar territory. For the first time, she was no longer the underdog, no longer underestimated. She was expected to lead, to guide, to inspire. And while that brought opportunity, it also brought pressure. She had been appointed the youngest ever student liaison to the Westbrook Equity Board. The position meant monthly reports, roundtable discussions with faculty, and handling grievances quietly brought to her by students too afraid to speak publicly. It was important work, and she gave it everything. But with visibility came scrutiny. Some parents, particularly those of old money legacy students, began whispering behind closed doors. They wondered aloud why a girl like Layla, who did not come from wealth, was given such a powerful role. They said things like, her intentions are good, but does she really understand the culture of this school? Layla heard the whispers, but she did not flinch. She had heard far worse. What rattled her, though, came from an unexpected place. One of her few true friends at Westbrook, Daniel, who had stood by her in the early days, began to grow distant. At first, it was subtle, missed lunches, canceled study sessions. But then, one afternoon, she overheard him talking to a group of boys from the basketball team. She was never supposed to be one of us, he said. She just got lucky. Layla turned and walked away before they could notice her. That night, she sat on her balcony, her journal open, the stars above unusually sharp in the cold. She wrote a single line. What do you do when those who once believed in you begin to wish you stayed small? The next morning, she returned to school with her head held high. If Daniel wanted to rewrite the story, she would simply write a better one. To redirect her focus, Layla poured her energy into the Legacy Through Action campaign. She expanded the initiative, proposing partnerships with local public schools. The goal was to create a mentorship exchange where Westbrook students would not just donate clothes or supplies, but time. She pitched the idea in front of the board with a calm fire in her eyes. Her words were direct. If Westbrook students are future leaders, let them lead with compassion, not distance. Some board members hesitated. One of them asked, "What do we gain from this?" Layla replied without pause, "Perspective, and the kind of character that makes privilege worth having." Her proposal passed. Within a month, groups of Westbrook students were visiting a nearby school every Thursday. They tutored, organized cleanups, and even collaborated on shared art projects. The transformation was mutual. Students who had once floated through the day with entitlement now returned to campus quieter, more grounded. One girl, famous for her birthday parties and her designer wardrobe, cried after reading a poem written by a 6th grade student about walking alone to school every day while dodging street violence. Layla stood in the back during that session and watched silently. These were the kinds of moments she lived for, the real ones, the ones no Instagram story could capture. Meanwhile, at Westbrook, resistance lingered in certain corners. Bryce Caldwell's father, a major donor to the school, expressed concern that Layla's growing influence was shifting the school's tradition too radically. At a private event, he cornered the principal and said, "You are letting this girl turn Westbrook into a public experiment. She does not understand the balance we have worked to preserve." The principal listened carefully, then replied, "I believe she understands it more clearly than most, and she is showing us what balance actually looks like." The following week, the school newsletter featured a full-page spotlight on Layla's initiatives. Her photo was centered above a quote from her last board meeting. "It is not about giving up privilege, it is about using it properly." Despite the momentum, Layla remained cautious. She knew that change made people uncomfortable, and that her presence still unsettled those who only valued legacy by bloodline. So, when she was nominated for the student body president role, her first instinct was to decline. The nomination came from a group of juniors, mostly students she had mentored. They submitted the form without telling her. When she found out, her first words were, "I am not the right face for this." But then her mother, upon hearing the story, placed a hand on hers and said, "You said the same thing before your first day at Westbrook, and look what happened." So, Layla reconsidered. And then she ran. Her campaign was simple. No posters with glitter, no slogans that rhymed. Just one promise. Leadership is not a title. It is a responsibility. Her opponents came from families with generations of Westbrook attendance. They held fundraisers. They passed out free cupcakes with their names iced on top. Layla did not do any of that. Instead, she visited every homeroom, sat down during free periods with students who felt invisible, and listened. She took notes. She asked, "What is one thing you would change here?" The answers were not grand. Shorter lunch lines, more mental health support, less pressure to be perfect. Layla folded those responses into her campaign speech. When election day arrived, she walked to the auditorium wearing the same navy blazer her mother had altered 3 times. She spoke calmly, clearly. She did not mention her past. She did not bring up what had been done to her. She spoke only about what she wanted to build. When the results were announced, the room held its breath, and then came the words, "Your new student body president is Layla Jenkins." There was a moment of silence, then a rising wave of applause, louder than any she had heard before. Students stood up, teachers clapped, even the headmaster, usually reserved, smiled and nodded with approval. And Layla, standing in the middle of it all, felt something she had never felt so fully before. Belonging, not because she changed herself to fit the school, but because she changed the school to fit what was right. The weeks following the election brought both reward and responsibility. Layla now had a voice in nearly every major decision affecting students. She sat on planning boards. She helped restructure student wellness programs. She even worked directly with faculty to revise policies around academic pressure and burnout. Her schedule was intense, her inbox always full, but her spirit never dimmed. What drove her now was not just memory, but momentum. One afternoon, while reviewing a proposal to revamp the mentorship program, Layla was approached by a new student named Zara. She was quiet, with a soft accent and hesitant posture. Layla smiled gently and asked if she needed help. Zara nodded. "I do not know where I fit," she said. "Everything here feels so far away." Layla motioned to the chair beside her. "You already fit," she said. "Now let us build the rest together." Zara would later join the mentorship team and become one of its most dedicated members. These small interactions, multiplied day after day, became Layla's true campaign. She was not interested in prestige. She wanted something that would last after her, something that would make it easier for the next girl or boy who arrived unsure of their place. She created a system called First Light, a platform where incoming students could anonymously ask questions, share their anxieties, and receive support from trained peer mentors. It was named after her mother's phrase, "You do not need to shine like the sun. You just need to be the first light that breaks the dark." The project was eventually adopted by other private schools in the region. Layla declined recognition each time. She said, "It is not about who started it. It is about who needed it." And yet, people still noticed. Education journals began to request interviews, foundations began to send donation offers, and behind it all, Layla remained centered, guided by the same promise she had made to herself that first year, never to become the kind of person who once ignored her. Then, in the spring of her final year, something happened that tested everything she had built. A scandal emerged. One of the trustees, a longtime donor with ties to Bryce Caldwell's family, had been caught pressuring school officials to alter admissions decisions in favor of friends. Layla found out when an anonymous envelope was slid under her locker. Inside was a copy of an email thread with subject lines that read, "Make room for the right people." The content revealed favoritism, manipulation, and dismissive references to scholarship students. Layla brought the letter to the principal immediately. He read it, sighed, and said, "I had heard rumors, but now we have proof." Layla did not hesitate. She called for an emergency session with the student council and requested a formal inquiry. Some advisors warned her to be careful. This donor had power. This could damage her reputation. But Layla stood firm. She had not spent all these years building truth only to become silent in its face. When the story broke, it swept across the school like wildfire. Some parents were furious. Others were relieved. The trustee in question resigned quietly. Bryce Caldwell, caught between loyalty and reality, withdrew from several school activities. In the middle of the chaos, Layla stood unshaken. She gave a press statement that read, "Education cannot be bought. Integrity must be louder than inheritance." Her words were printed in regional newspapers. One editorial read, "A student at Westbrook Academy has done more for transparency than most school boards have in decades, but not everyone celebrated her. Some students avoided her. A few muttered that she had ruined the school's reputation." Layla absorbed the blow without flinching. She had not set out to be liked. She had set out to make a difference. And now, as graduation neared, that difference echoed in every hallway. Students wore First Light pins on their backpacks, teachers quoted her in class, younger students left folded thank you notes in her locker. She never read them aloud, but she kept every single one. Graduation day arrived with skies so blue it looked staged. Layla stood in front of her mirror at home wearing her cap and gown. Her mother adjusted the collar with shaking hands. "You earned this," she whispered. "You earned all of it." Elijah Malik flew in the night before, having spent the previous month in Sierra Leone. He arrived quietly, slipping into the back of the ceremony hall unnoticed. But Layla saw him. She always saw him. When her name was called, she stepped forward with a calm smile. The applause began immediately and did not stop. She crossed the stage, not just as a graduate, but as a symbol of what resilience could look like when matched with compassion. After the ceremony, the principal requested a final moment on stage. He raised his hand and said, "This year, for the first time in our school's history, we will be naming a new honor, the Layla Jenkins Award for Transformational Leadership." The students erupted into cheers. Layla froze, her breath caught in her throat. The principal looked directly at her and added, "For reminding us that sometimes the smallest voices carry the biggest truths." That evening, the school hosted a reception. Alumni, board members, faculty, and students all gathered in the garden under strings of lights. Layla stood quietly near a table of lemonade when Bryce Caldwell approached. His tone was different now, quiet, steady. "I was wrong," he said. "All of us were." She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "I know," he added. "I am going to try to be better, not for applause, just because it is time." She extended her hand. "Then start here," she said. And he did. That night, Layla stood beside her father and mother as the headmaster took a photo for the school's record. She smiled, not the guarded smile of her first year, but one full and free. And later, as the garden lights dimmed and the last of the guests left, she sat under the same old oak tree she had once passed on her first day, alone and uncertain. Now, the tree shaded a girl who had outgrown silence, who had not only changed how others saw her, but how they saw each other. The poor girl they laughed at had become the blueprint for what courage looked like. Long after the ceremony ended and the lawn chairs had been folded away, the memory of Layla Jenkins lingered in every inch of Westbrook Academy. Her legacy was not carved in stone or displayed in gold. It was carried instead in voices that had once gone unheard and now spoke freely. It lived in the first-year student who raised her hand for the first time, in the boy who no longer sat alone at lunch, in the teacher who paused before assuming what a student could or could not do. These quiet changes, multiplied across days and semesters, became the real proof of what Layla had built. Not just a moment, but a movement. Not just recognition, but reflection. And though she had graduated and moved on to universities and councils and youth platforms around the world, her story had already done its most important work. It had planted seeds in the hearts of people who once believed they had no power. Maybe you have been where Layla was, sitting in a classroom, feeling small because of where you came from or what you wore. Maybe you were the new student, the one who felt invisible, the one who heard the whispers, who saw the glances, who carried the silence like a second backpack. Or maybe you were on the other side. Maybe you looked down on someone and did not know better. Maybe you stayed quiet when you should have spoken up. If any of that sounds like you, then you are not alone. And this is your moment to choose what happens next. We would love to hear your story. Have you ever been misjudged because of your background? Have you stood up for someone who was? Or have you learned a hard lesson about seeing beyond appearances? Tell us in the comments below. Your voice might help someone else feel seen for the first time. And if this story meant something to you, if it stirred a memory or gave you hope, please like this video, Subscribe to our channel and share it with someone who might need it today. Because somewhere out there, there is another Layla walking through a hallway with her head down, wondering if anyone sees her. Let us be the people who do. We will see you next time with another story that just might change how you look at the world around you.